Okay, I'm back. The second part to the eastern U.S. forests. So now we're moving on to the Gulf Atlantic coastal plain and the Piedmont Plateau. So notice I combined these two. In your data set, you analyzed Georgia to kind of represent the Gulf Atlantic coastal plain and North Carolina to represent the Piedmont. But if you notice, both of those states kind of span this boundary and even go into some of the other physiographic regions. Um, so let's talk about those. These landscapes are relatively flat in these two physiographic regions. So as you move from the Gulf Atlantic coastal plain to the Piedmont, really it's just this long gradual increase in elevation from the coast. And then the Piedmont Plateau kind of takes you through to the foothills of the Appalachians where you then get greater elevation change. So this picture at the bottom kind of shows like we're standing in the Piedmont Plateau looking up into the Appalachian Mountains. And so over that entire, those two entire physiographic regions, we have a change in elevation of only about 300 feet. So relatively flat, very little elevation change. And lots of this area, especially as you get closer to the coast, is going to be swamps, marshes, and these kind of like slow meandering rivers just because we have such small elevation change. The climate in the region, here's just a few examples. What I really want to point out here is the transition from kind of a uniform precip distribution or definitely summer dominated precip. So these two on the right here show coastal plain climate diagrams. But then as you move a little bit further west into the Piedmont, you start to get some areas where you might have some dry spots during the summer. So in this Mississippi, not a huge dry period, but a little one. But then you can see in parts of Georgia, we might have a fairly dry period for part of the year. So as you move west, we're starting to get into conditions where you might have some mild drought conditions. And then in that intro slide, 2 slides ago, I mentioned marshes and swamps. And so just so you're clear on the difference, marsh is a wetland ecosystem that has poorly drained soils, but it's dominated by grasses or herbaceous plants. So this picture shows, we don't really see any trees in this area. Whereas a swamp is kind of the same conditions as far as poorly drained soils, but it's dominated by woody species. And so a swamp is kind of like a filled-in marsh, if you will. So that's the difference between swamp and marsh. Just thinking about the vegetation. In those swampy areas where you have that standing water, that's where we're going to get oak, gum, cypress forests showing up. And so those are forests that can tolerate flooding all the time. As you move out of those swampy areas and the soils are a little bit drier, then you get loblolly shortleaf pine, longleaf pine, and oak pine forest showing up. And remember, the difference really between the longleaf pine and the loblolly shortleaf pine is that longleaf pine can handle a little bit wetter conditions. So that's where you find the difference between those two pine forest cover types. And then as we're moving to the western part of these regions, we get more and more of the oak hickory forest showing up. And that's because we get more of that seasonal drought showing up in the western part of that this range. And then just another kind of part of the biodiversity of this region is the lianas and the epiphytes. So in this lower picture, it shows a liana. So it's this woody vine kind of growing around this tree. And then here, the epiphytes, this is Spanish moss growing in those trees. And so the epiphytes are both of these are non-parasitic. They just use another plant as kind of a supporting structure, essentially. Just a note about the Piedmont Plateau. So this is the one that's going to be a little further west than the coastal plain. There's a lot of pine plantations in this region in particular, and parts of the coastal plain as well. So here's just a picture of a loblolly pine plantation. These are super, super productive plantations and where lots of timber products come from in the United States. And then again, in this western part, more in the Piedmont, we see more of these oak hickory forests showing up that are fairly drought tolerant and fairly fire tolerant. Okay, so now let's move on to the Blue Ridge and the newer Appalachians. So again, I've combined two physiographic regions here, just like I did in your analysis. Lots of ridges and valleys like you would expect in a mountain range. But if you haven't been to the US, don't expect it to look like the Rockies. This mountain range is much older, so roughly 480 million years old. And so because of that age, it's just had a lot more erosion. And so it's a much smoother kind of looking mountain range than what we have here in the Rockies. And it's also not as high. Highest elevation is, I think it's just over 5,000 feet. Don't quote me on that because I can't remember offhand. Okay, and climate in this region, let me go back to the map here. And these kind of the Piedmont and the coastal plain and these Appalachians, you can see they're spanning a really large north to south gradient. So obviously we're going to have big temperature changes throughout these physiographic regions, and you can kind of see that here. Here's 3 climate diagrams throughout these physiographic regions. Up in Pennsylvania, we have the growing season length is going to limit the forest cover types, so we've got some really cold temperatures in the winter, whereas down in North Carolina, we don't have that. We have a growing season that can really last all year long, and so that's going to affect the distribution of forests and cause some variability in the distribution of forests within this or these physiographic regions. So there's several forest cover types to think about in the Blue Ridge and newer Appalachians. In the kind of lowland or elevations, we tend to find lots of those oak hickory forest and loblolly shortleaf pine. So kind of the drier, warmer areas are going to be dominated by those forest cover types. Kind of mid-elevation in this region is really just an oak-dominated forest, and that's not a forest cover type we talked about. But there's about 12-ish species of oaks that are really dominant in this region. And that's what the forests are throughout much of the kind of mid-elevation range of these physiographic regions. And then another kind of interesting part about these physiographic regions is that there's these remnant spruce fir forests at some of the highest elevation peaks in these physiographic regions. And those are kind of left over from when the glaciers were covering and were extending down into the United States. Climate was much colder, and so spruce fir forests dominated this region. But as those glaciers have receded and it's warmed up, they've kind of like, they've receded to the tops of the peaks in the Appalachians, and so there's still a few spots. And it's kind of interesting where those spruce fir forests have kind of gone to the top and died off. A lot of times there are no forests that have regenerated there, and they're what I call kind of bald spots, and so they're just herbaceous dominated tops to some of these mountains, which is kind of interesting. One other interesting note about these regions is how diverse they are for temperate forests. The biodiversity is second only to China's temperate forests, which are in the eastern part of China. So really diverse forests with lots of different species and lots of different oak species in particular. Okay, let's move on to the west side of the Appalachians, so the Appalachian Plateau in the interior plains. I lumped these because the forest cover types are quite similar. When you're in the Appalachian Plateau, you're much higher elevation, and it kind of tapers back down as you move through the interior plains, but the landscape is generally like kind of flat and rolling hills. This is a picture from a tower where there's some instruments measuring forest function, and you can just see how flat this forest is. This particular picture was taken in Indiana. So not a lot of topography in this part of the country. We're talking about a pretty wide range of climates. So we've got a large north to south gradient and also a big east to west gradient. And so these two figures kind of highlight both of the changes that you would expect due to that. From Pennsylvania, well, this actually doesn't describe it very well, does it? So we're going to have differences in temperature. So we're going to have in the northern places, growing season length is going to limit what forest cover type can occur there. And then as you move east to west, you get changes in precip as well. So this is Pennsylvania, where we have fairly uniform precip. And then this is in Illinois, where you can see there's a decent amount of precip in the summer, but we don't get very much in the winter months. So we get less precip, although it is still dominated by summer precip. So just looking at the vegetation and the forest cover types we'd expect here. Here in the western part of the regions we're talking about, we get lots of oak hickory. So you're going to see oak hickory show up in lots of different places. However, as you move to a little bit north in these areas, you're going to see more of the maple beech birch forest show up. So the cooler it gets, it's going to be a little bit wetter. So you're not going to have drought, you're not going to have fires. And the maple beech birch forest can outcompete the oak hickory forest as far as growth goes. In the wettest areas, you're going to see elm ash cottonwood show up. So this is the first place we've talked about that forest cover type. And then in the most northern regions, you're going to see oak, or not oak, red white jack pine and the aspen birch show up. So we're going to have this starting to get almost into transitional forest in the most northern places. And so there we're talking about northern Michigan, parts of Wisconsin and Minnesota, we might see these red white jack pine and aspen birch forests showing up along with some of these other forest cover types. And then I just kind of mentioned here that we're talking about oak hickories, and at the furthest west in these physiographic regions we're talking about, these oak hickory forests really transition to oak hickory savannas. The forest cover becomes discontinuous and you get a lot more grass cover. And so that's where we start transitioning towards the grasslandy ecosystems. All right, let's talk about Ozark Plateau in the Wichitas. So I've combined these because the forest cover types are very similar. And the landscapes are actually quite similar as well. They just have a little bit different climates because one's a little more north and one's a little more south. But generally, we're talking lots of mountainous landscapes, steep slopes, and narrow valleys. And you know, this is a very small, fairly small part of the country. And I think probably not visited a lot. Growing up in Michigan, it wasn't a place we went on vacation very much, and I think when you're in the mountains of Colorado, you don't think about going there. But if you ever get out that way, I would definitely encourage you to go visit. It's a really beautiful area, lots of really pretty rivers to canoe on, and different vegetation than what we have around here. So climate, this is just one climate diagram, but what I want to highlight here is that we actually have a fairly distinct dry season throughout parts of these two physiographic regions. And so that means plants that are more drought tolerant, or forest cover types that are more drought tolerant, are going to be ones that are more common in these regions. And so that's what we see, is we see lots of oaks, hickories, and pines really dominating both of these physiographic regions. So oak hickory is really the dominant, and then you get the loblolly and shortleaf pine forest showing up. You get some oak pine forest showing up. So any kind of combination of oak, hickory, and pines are going to be really common. In the driest places, we see the loblolly and shortleaf pine forest being dominant. So that's going to be on the ridge tops where you have the shallowest and rockiest soils. And then down in the valleys, of course, we've got water that's going to be more available. And so then we get our species that can tolerate and like those flooded conditions. So elm ash cottonwoods are really common. And then in the warmest places, we do find some oak, gum, and cypress forest showing up as well. Okay, so I'm going to pause here. I've got one more video that's going to cover one more physiographic region and then just talk about the management considerations in the eastern U.S.